Hi everybody, here again, just come off the air from my radio show that I do on a Sunday afternoon, covering for my friend Pete James. It's a something different show, and hopefully I played quite a lot of nice folky country music this time around. It's always very hard to come up with a playlist of music for this show, but I do enjoy doing it, so hey, there we go. But now it's time for me to read from my novel Walking on Cinders. As I say, I've been doing this every evening at 6pm, and we're on chapter 26 now of the book, and so hopefully you're enjoying the story so far, and I'll continue where I left off. Chris didn't know where he was. He woke to bright lights, strange sounds, and the cleanliness of everything around him. Then he realised he was in bed, lying between cleanly pressed sheets, and if he tilted his head a little, he could see further down the ward. He must be in hospital, but he had no idea how he got there. Ah, Mr. Aston. The voice was suddenly there, drowning out all sound, yet Chris found he could not pinpoint its exact location. I'm glad you finally come round. We were all a little worried about you last night. Having had no luck in locating the voice on his own, Chris asked for guidance. Where are you? He said feebly, his voice far removed from the one that he knew. There was a giggle. A body filled his vision, and the person moved towards him, and then he moved his gaze upwards to take in the name badge and the pretty face. Amy, he said slowly. There you are. The nurse smiled and helped the soldier to sit up against the pillows. What happened? Again she smiled, now standing at the foot of his bed. Well, Mr. Aston, she began, looking him up and down. You were injured late yesterday afternoon, and out on the battlefield. You were a rather bad bullet wound to the right thigh, and you hit your head when you fell to the ground. Silently, Chris strained to think of what had happened, but he appeared unable to draw it from his memory. I don't remember, he stuttered. Yes, I'd be surprised if you did, the nurse replied in her own soft tone. Your condition deteriorated on the journey here. The doctor was quite worried when you arrived. You were unconscious. They operated on you and managed to remove the bullet, though. But you lost a lot of blood, and now you're here and you're awake. We believe your memory will return within hours. There was a silence while Chris tried hard to compute this information, and the nurse busied herself with adjusting the sheets and copying down details from a screen to the left, before attaching this to a clipboard at the bed head. Then she paused and looked at her patient, hands on her hips. Well, I must be going. I have many more soldiers to see this morning. The doctor will be along soon, and last night there was a mention of some visitors for you. That'll be nice, won't it? Chris half smiled. Amy, he murmured, as the nurse started to walk away. She turned and waved to him. I'll be back later, she called, before disappearing around the corner. Chris breathed a deep sigh of relief and slipped once more back into sleep. Mere hours after Amy had left his bed, Chris was graced by a visit from Major General Sir Adam Dutale himself. He did not expect this, so was surprised when the rotund figure appeared through a door at the far end of the ward. Christopher! His voice boomed from 3 beds down. Getting closer to the bed, he drew up a chair and took a seat. What are you doing here? Chris managed to stutter. Well, Chris, Dutale said in a low voice, deadly serious, I feel as if I have betrayed you. There are things that I didn't explain, never had the time to explain, and now I feel your hospitalization is partly my responsibility. In truth, Chris had never expected this from the leader, nor had he for 1 minute thought that he might come here to explain. It was not only intriguing but gratifying too. There are certain things I need to say, loose ends that need to be tied up, the Major General continued. Firstly, the secret documents that were found on Jennifer's person were indeed meant to be transferred to me by the President of the United Isles of Great Britain. I'm sorry that it needed to happen as it did. I feel it's important that I tell you these files were stowed upon her, in secret, without her prior knowledge or consent. At the time, there was no other option. I had my suspicions, Chris broke in. He had a strange feeling that Dutale would now reveal what he had long feared. Yes, but that's not all. You remember me mentioning my investigations of Colonel Smith? Of course. Then you'll forgive me for being frank with my assessment of the situation. Now that the war is almost over, my own intelligence has proved to be correct. Colonel Smith was responsible for your crash, and you probably know his reason for being that. And you probably know his reason was to destroy the files that they And as you probably know, His reason was to destroy the files before they reached here. Chris considered his next move. Would it be best to reveal his own prior knowledge? We had worked out that much too, sir. You see, as we're now being frank, the others and I discovered those secret documents at the crash site, so we had our own suspicions about Colonel Smith long before we arrived. We kept quiet, though. We were always unsure about his motives. Major General Adam Dutail laughed, and the laugh rang around the ward, causing other soldiers to look up in surprise. You don't know how relieved it makes me feel to know that we are both in a position to reveal truths. I, happened to know a little more. It would appear that your leader, Colonel Smith, was working undercover for the enemy, providing United equipment and sometimes even channeling the funds meant for Thames Regimental Barracks over to the reformed government. I'm led to believe that he was promised a large sum of money if and when the reformed army were victorious. This shocked even Chris, for he couldn't believe that one man could have such an evil intent inside of him. How could Colonel Smith do this to his country and all those who had died for it? He's a traitor, Chris breathed. It was all he could think to say. Dutail nodded. People of that nature have no soul, he said grimly. I am only glad that Commandant Babineau was able to aid me in discovering this fact, working as a secret agent for both myself and for Colonel Smith. Hold on a moment, Chris said suddenly. The constant revelations were now beginning to tire him out. Babineau was working undercover for you. I have to say, I don't consider him a very nice person. You would not be the first to say that, the Major General smiled. But he is strong-willed and effective in his job, and I'm grateful for that. I'm glad you think so, Chris thought, although he knew he couldn't say it out loud. Instead, he returned to the matter at hand. So what's going to happen to Colonel Smith, he said. Dutail smiled, and Chris noticed the other soldiers on the ward. Many were sitting up in their beds, their heads turned just enough to be able to overhear their conversation. Well, he began again, Colonel Smith has known for a little while that the net is drawing in. Deep down, I believe we all know that along the reformed army would fail. But as I have said many times, money drives people to make crazy decisions. Shortly, I will be dispatching a small group back to London who will attend to the court case. Chris nodded. It was obvious that the course of action for someone who had committed such evil crimes would be court. Dutail, believing he had covered every point, now got up from his chair and moved to stand at the end of Chris's bed. Here he leaned against the metal frame and looked the Capitaine up and down. You're a good man, Chris, he said finally, and I hope I've not tired you out today. I admit that I'm weaker than I was, Chris replied bitterly, but it was good to see you all the same. This time it was Dutail who nodded, turning away to walk back towards the end of the ward. Oh, and Chris, he called, we'll see what we can do about making your new rank permanent. He smiled at the soldier before disappearing back around the corner. Chris was pleased. Slowly he lowered himself into a comfortable position, and he was soon asleep again. Later that afternoon, Chris was surprised by a visit from those whom he loved so dearly. Ewan and Jennifer brought him flowers, while the twins had decided on a large box of chocolates. Chris beamed from the moment he saw them all walking towards him. Chris, Ewan called as they neared the soldier's bedside. It's really great to see you. The corporal was smiling and walking hand in hand with Jennifer. Yes, she continued, placing the flowers on a table at the end of the bed. We got a call last night to say your condition was serious, and we were more prepared to see you lying in some sort of coma. Chris grunted and ignored the last remark. I've always been strong, Jennifer, you know that, he said. A single bullet wound is not going to get the better of me. Beside him, Ewan Roberts nodded and placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. We were worried, that's all, he finished. Chris shifted his weight and everyone watched, shocked to see such a strong man reduced to tubes and drips that were attached at his hospital bedside. We're going to get some coffee, Ewan said, after a moment's pause, which was filled only with the conversations of other injured soldiers who occupied the beds all around. Chris made the slightest of acknowledgements, pointed and smiled at the flowers. Then he was left alone with the French twins as Ewan and Jennifer exited through the nearest doorway. Belle and Renee edged closer to the injured soldier's bedside. Of them all, it was they who knew the least about Chris Aston. Yet at the same time, they were the ones by whom he was most intrigued. We have brought you some chocolate, Chris, Renee said in her thick French accent, slowly producing a box from behind her back. She placed it on the bed and waited for a response. Thank you, Chris replied slowly, but you really didn't have to. For a moment the twins felt rejected, but then they began to understand. War is no place for young girls like you and Jennifer, he continued, pausing to sip from a glass of water on the side table. He had not realised until now how dry his throat really was. You should never have been in that medical tent, any of you, and I thank God that none of you were injured. But Ewan Roberts has a wayward personality, probably from being a professional actor. He got you involved, and for a while I was angry with him. But he has since explained every detail of your arrival, and now I feel I have no choice but to approve of his actions in the circumstances. I'm glad that you understand, Rennie replied, taking a chocolate and handing it to Chris. You see, we have had no choice but to get out of the village and away from our papa. Beside her, her twin shifted awkwardly, and unfortunately for her, Chris noted such behaviour. Belle, he asked slowly, it looks like there might be something you're not telling me. It would have seemed to any other outsider looking in that he was treating her like a naughty younger sister. No, Chris, she replied suddenly, fixed to the spot. It's just that I have discovered something, and only today told the others about it. You are the only one who does not know. Immediately she blushed and looked up towards the dirt-speckled ceiling. 2 beds down from Chris, a soldier coughed loudly and repeatedly, causing a diversion of attention for a split second, and it was then that he caught another glimpse of Amy moving down the wall towards him. His heart lifted with thoughts of her nearby presence, before he turned his concentration back to the matter at hand. Well then, he said authoritatively, I think you had better tell me what's going on. Almost instinctively, the twins looked at each other and nodded. They moved then the 2 chairs which had been placed against the opposite wall and sat down and began to tell their story. Well, Belle began tentatively. The best way to explain this would be to, well, I was in the house with Papa. He told me some things that I would never have believed had it come from anyone else. Tears were forming in the French girl's eyes, and they clung to her eyelashes, catching the light. What she's trying to say, Rennie continued, placing an arm around her twin sister so as to comfort her, is that our Papa told us that our mother is not dead. She paused for a moment, allowing Chris to compute the information. I have to say I was shocked when Belle finally told me. I'm not surprised, Chris interjected, making his verdict on this damning piece of information. Surely this affects what you want to do now, though. Naturally, the twins sighed together, not breaking eye contact. We have made plans, and we hope to begin searching for her soon. They continued an explanation, and Chris's response was interrupted when Ewan and Jennifer reappeared with a tiny tray of coffee cups. They were grumbling rather loudly. Damn coffee machines, Ewan fumed, a little too loudly. It took forever to even dispense the stupid things. Gingerly he moved forwards and placed the tray in front of the flowers, revealing a somewhat flustered Jennifer behind, who was the first to notice the twins' distress and the expressionless look on Chris's face. You've told him then, she said patiently, leaning down to squat between the twins. That must have been a really hard thing to do. The twins turned to Voss's sweetheart, who had been their idol for so long, and they smiled. Here was a woman who knew exactly what words to use for any situation. She never failed to comfort the upset, and she had proved by recent events care for the injured and the dying. She had a loving nature which she instantly used to soothe the situation. We, the twins replied in unison. I have been dreading telling Chris the most, Belle continued. We always thought that he had something against us, with us turning up out of the blue. We thought keeping this secret might only make things worse. At the back of the group, Ewan smiled. That's just Chris's nature, I'm afraid, he said simply. Chris didn't look pleased. He gave a short, sharp cough, bringing them all back to reality. We still haven't accomplished anything, he said simply. What is it that you're all planning to do? Well, we're going to go back to London, of course. Ewan Roberts' voice grew in volume. His head appeared from behind the bunch of flowers where he began handing out coffee cups to each of the group. Thank God for Nero books, he added before Chris had a chance to reply. You going back to London? Chris questioned, eyeing them suspiciously. This time it was Jennifer who fielded the question. Yes, Chris, we are. The Major General has asked us to undertake some very important business. Oh. The soldier's reply left little to the imagination, and he considered the court case that would soon engulf them all. Dutel was here earlier. He told me that a group of you were going back to London to oversee Colonel Smith's time in court. There was an audible sigh of relief. Ewan Roberts had not wished to explain, and so was glad that the Major General had done the truth for him. "That's right," he answered truthfully. "I felt that we might be more use over there. Hopefully we won't get too involved, but it will give the twins a nice break before they begin their search." For a moment Chris was still, wondering if perhaps his friends were deserting him. "I shall miss you," he said finally. "Well, we're not deserting you, Chris," Jennifer smiled. "We'll be in contact with the hospital every day, and if your condition deteriorates, we'll be straight back here to be at your bedside." "That's good to know. Well, we did ask if you could be transferred to the Royal Military," Ewan said simply, "but the doctors here said your condition needed to be monitored so soon after the incident. They told me they would consider to move you if your condition improved." Chris nodded again. That explanation seemed to suffice, and yet still he wondered what it was that Dutel had planned for them when they arrived back in the capital. Until now, both Belle and René Levette had been sitting in silence, taking the conversation in and straightening it out in their own minds. The idea that within a week they would be cast out on their own again, and this time they would be seeking a mother who they had always considered dead, was really surprising. "We hope that we will enjoy our time in London," René smiled, breaking the tension almost immediately. "We have heard that it is a lovely city." In the bed beside them, Chris turned his head towards her and smiled. "Oh, you will love London," he said after a pause, reminiscing on the happy times he, Ewan and Thomas had spent training at the Thames Regimental Barracks. "London is a beautiful city, and it may be my adopted home." Around him, everybody's spirits seemed to be lifted. "We'll leave in a few days' time, as soon as feasible," Ewan said finally, placing the plastic cup he was holding down on the table. "It will take time to make the arrangements, and the Major General did say that he might call on us once more before we leave." To Chris, everyone seemed to be settled. His friends were heading back home, while these beautiful French twins were off to seek an entirely different future, one which meant that he might never set eyes on them again. "Well, I wish you all good luck," he said, almost in parting, adjusting his position so that he was able to lean over and shake his comrades' hands. "And if I don't see you again," he continued, gesturing towards the twins, "then I hope you find your mother, and with that, a better future." Suddenly the girls were no longer sitting. They were up and at Chris's side, planting kisses on each of his cheeks. "We will not forget you, Chris," they said in chorus of giggles, and they joined Jennifer and Ewan at the end of the bed. "Are you sure you'll be all right?" Jennifer cooed, as the others began to walk towards the door at the far end of the ward. "Well," Chris said coarsely, aware of how much energy he had exerted, "you've worn me out, but I'm in capable hands." He turned to point towards a nurse who was still dealing with a patient 2 beds down. Jennifer couldn't help but smile when she saw Chris staring. She thought the nurse prim, proper, and very pretty, even from this distance. "Jennifer," Chris called as she was walking away. She turned and looked back. "Look after him, eh?" The girl nodded, knowing she would. So that's chapter 26 of my novel Walking on Cinders. Tomorrow evening, 6 p.m, I shall be back to read chapter 27, and we have 32 chapters of this book to read, so not too long. We're entering the home stretch now, but still lots more exciting stories to reveal. Hope you can join me tomorrow night.